November 1989, Musicland Studios, Munich. Brian May and Freddie Mercury stood on opposite sides of the mixing console, neither willing to back down. The argument had started over something technical, a guitar arrangement on a track they'd been working on for hours, but had evolved into something more stubborn, more personal. Brian wanted the guitar prominent, layered, complex. Freddie wanted it simpler, cleaner, more space for the vocals. They'd had creative disagreements before. 20 years of collaboration guaranteed friction between two strong artistic personalities. But this time felt different. This time, neither man was compromising. Brian left the studio that night thinking he'd return tomorrow and they'd sort it out properly. They always did. But tomorrow's session was canceled. Freddie wasn't feeling well. Then the next session was postponed, and the next. By the time they were back in the studio together weeks later, the argument seemed trivial. They recorded the song Freddie's Way without discussion, and Brian said nothing. 2 years later, Freddie was gone, and for 30 years, every time Brian heard that song, he heard his own stubbornness, a petty argument he wished he could take back but never would. By November 1989, Queen had been making music together for nearly 2 decades. Brian May and Freddie Mercury had developed a creative partnership that was both extraordinarily productive and occasionally contentious. They were different in almost every way. Brian methodical and technical, trained in astrophysics, approaching music with scientific precision. Freddie instinctive and theatrical, self-taught, approaching music as emotional expression first and technical execution second. These differences had created some of Queen's greatest work. Brian's intricate guitar arrangements combined with Freddie's soaring vocals and dramatic sensibility produced songs that were both musically sophisticated and emotionally immediate. But those same differences also led to friction in the studio, creative disagreements that ranged from minor quibbles to full-blown arguments about artistic direction. Most of the time, they worked through conflicts professionally. Someone would compromise, or they'd find a third option that satisfied both visions, or one of them would convince the other through demonstration rather than argument. Roger Taylor and John Deacon had become expert at reading the room, knowing when to intervene and when to let Brian and Freddie work through their disagreement privately. The Miracle album sessions in 1988 and 1989 had been particularly important for Queen. They'd returned to the studio after a difficult period, reconnecting with their collaborative chemistry and producing work they were all proud of. The atmosphere had been generally positive, creative energy flowing more naturally than it had in years. But even good sessions had their moments of tension. And in November 1989, during work on what would become one of the album's tracks, Brian and Freddie found themselves locked in a disagreement that neither seemed willing to resolve through their usual methods of compromise and discussion. The argument was about guitar layering on a particular song. Brian had developed an intricate arrangement with multiple guitar tracks, creating a rich, textured sound. He'd spent hours perfecting the interplay between the different guitar lines, building something he considered one of his better technical achievements. Freddie listened to the playback and shook his head. "It's too much, Brian. The guitars are fighting with the vocal. I need space to breathe in the mix." Brian bristled. "The guitars aren't fighting, they're supporting. This is what gives the song its depth." "Depth that buries the melody," Freddie countered. "Strip it back. Keep one, maybe 2 guitar tracks. Let the song breathe. If we strip it back, it loses its character. It becomes generic. If we keep all this, it becomes cluttered. Choose, Brian. What serves the song?" This was where their fundamental difference always emerged. Freddie believed in simplicity in service of emotional impact. Brian believed in complexity in service of musical sophistication. Both were right according to their own artistic philosophy. Both were unwilling to accept that the other's approach might work equally well. The conversation escalated. Brian felt Freddie was dismissing his technical work without properly understanding what he'd built. Freddie felt Brian was prioritizing technical achievement over the song's emotional core. Roger and John exchanged glances. This was more heated than their usual creative disagreements. "This is my arrangement," Brian said finally, his voice tight with frustration. "I've spent days working on this. You can't just dismiss it because it doesn't match your immediate vision." "And this is my vocal," Freddie replied. matching Brian's intensity. I can't sing properly when I'm fighting through a wall of guitars. Either the arrangement serves the song, or we're just showing off. They went back and forth, neither budging, until the session reached a natural endpoint, and they called it a night. Brian left the studio angry, mentally preparing his arguments for the next day's session. He would demonstrate why his arrangement worked. He would play it back at different levels, show Freddie how the complexity added rather than detracted. He was certain they'd resolve it tomorrow. They always resolved things eventually. But the next day's session was canceled. Freddie wasn't feeling well, nothing specific, just general exhaustion and discomfort that made working impossible. Brian was frustrated but understanding. They'd been working hard. Everyone needed rest occasionally. Then the session scheduled for 2 days later was also postponed. Freddie still wasn't up to recording. Then another cancellation. And another. By the time they were back in the studio together nearly 3 weeks later, everything had shifted. Freddie was quieter than usual, moving more carefully, clearly not at full strength, but pushing through anyway. The energy in the room was different. Everyone treading more gently, being more accommodating, sensing that something had changed even if they didn't understand exactly what. When they returned to the disputed track, Brian had made a decision. He'd had 3 weeks to think about the argument, and in the context of Freddie's health struggles and the fragility of their working time together, the guitar arrangement suddenly seemed less important than he'd thought. I simplified the guitars, Brian said, showing Freddie the revised arrangement. Kept the main line, removed the layering. You were right, it needed space. Freddie listened to the playback and nodded. Thank you, Brian, this works better. That was it. No acknowledgement of the previous argument, no discussion of why Brian had changed his approach, just professional acceptance and moving forward. They recorded Freddie's vocal that day, finished the track, and continued working on the album. Brian told himself he'd made a creative decision based on what served the song best. But the truth he didn't want to acknowledge was simpler and more uncomfortable. He'd capitulated because Freddie was unwell, because their time together suddenly felt more precious than being right about a guitar arrangement, because winning an argument seemed petty when your friend was struggling to maintain the energy to work at all. The album was released in 1989. The track in question became one of the songs Brian had mixed feelings about. Musically, it worked. Freddie's vocal was beautiful. The simpler arrangement did allow the melody to breathe exactly as Freddie had predicted. But every time Brian heard it, he heard the absence of what he'd originally created. He heard his own surrender. He heard the moment he'd realized that time with Freddie was finite, even if he didn't yet understand just how finite. As 1990 progressed and Freddie's health continued to decline, the November argument faded into insignificance against the larger reality they were all confronting. There were more important things to think about than creative disagreements over guitar arrangements. They were focused on recording as much as possible, while Freddie still could, capturing his voice before it was gone. By 1991, Freddie was dying, and everyone knew it. The arguments about arrangements and mixing and creative direction had stopped completely. They recorded whatever Freddie could manage, however he wanted it recorded, grateful for every note he could still deliver. Freddie died in November 1991, and the November 1989 argument became something Brian thought about occasionally but didn't dwell on extensively. There were bigger regrets, more significant moments, more important memories to process in the overwhelming grief that followed. But the regret didn't disappear. It evolved, became more subtle, more persistent. Every time Brian worked on Queen material, every time he listened to that particular track from The Miracle, he was reminded of the argument. Not the technical details of the mild agreement, but the emotional reality underneath it. His stubbornness, his ego, his unwillingness to compromise until circumstance forced him to. For years, Brian kept this regret private. He didn't discuss it in interviews when people asked about working with Freddie. He didn't mention it when documenting Queen's history. It was too small, too personal, too embarrassing to admit that among all his memories of Freddie Mercury, this petty argument occupied space in his conscience. But regrets have a way of growing heavier over time, not lighter. And by 2018, nearly 30 years after that November argument and 27 years after Freddie's death, Brian found himself thinking about it more frequently, not less. He was 71 years old, looking back across decades of life without his friend. processing grief that had evolved but never truly resolved. And he began to understand that the argument represented something larger than just creative disagreement. It represented all the moments when he'd been difficult, when he could have been easy, when he'd prioritized being right over being kind, when he'd wasted precious time on things that didn't ultimately matter. In a 2018 interview for a documentary about Queen's creative process, Brian finally opened up about the memory that had been bothering him for 3 decades. People often think creative partnerships are constantly harmonious, Brian said, his voice careful and measured. But the truth is, Freddie and I argued. Quite a lot, actually. We were very different people with very different approaches to music. The interviewer nodded, expecting standard stories about artistic collaboration and productive conflict. But there's one argument I still regret, Brian continued, and something in his tone shifted. November 1989. We were working on a track, and I'd created this elaborate guitar arrangement. Freddie wanted it simpler. I refused to compromise. Got quite stubborn about it, actually. Defensive about my work. Brian paused, his hands unconsciously forming shapes as if holding a guitar. We ended the session without resolving it. I went home planning to come back the next day and fight my case more effectively. But the next session was canceled. Freddie wasn't well, and by the time we were back in the studio weeks later, I'd simplified the arrangement, gave Freddie what he'd wanted originally. So you reached a compromise? The interviewer asked. No, Brian said quietly. I surrendered. And I told myself it was a creative decision, but honestly it was because I realized time was more valuable than being right. Freddie's health was clearly struggling, and arguing about guitar layering suddenly seemed monumentally stupid. He looked directly at the camera, his expression showing the weight of 3 decades of carrying this memory. Every time I hear that song, I hear my own stubbornness. I hear 3 weeks we lost because I couldn't just let go of my ego. And I think about how many other times I was probably difficult when I could have been easy. How many sessions I made harder than they needed to be because I was protecting my artistic vision. Did you ever discuss it with Freddie afterward? The interviewer asked. Brian shook his head. Never came up. By the time we were recording again, we had more important things to focus on. And then he was gone, and I couldn't take it back. The documentary included this segment, and it resonated deeply with viewers, not because the argument was dramatic or the regret was unusual, but because it was so recognizable. Everyone who'd lost someone could remember moments of unnecessary friction, petty disagreements that seemed important at the time, but trivial in retrospect, time wasted on being right instead of being present. In the years since that interview, Brian has been more open about this particular regret. He mentions it occasionally when discussing his relationship with Freddie, using it as an example of what he wishes he'd done differently. If I could go back, Brian said in a 2021 interview, I wouldn't change the big moments. The important conversations, the significant decisions, those were handled as well as we could handle them given our limitations and circumstances. What I'd change are the small moments, the unnecessary arguments, the times I was stubborn about things that didn't actually matter. He gestured toward his studio equipment. That guitar arrangement? Freddie was right. The simpler version served the song better. I knew it intellectually even at the time, but my ego wouldn't let me admit it immediately. So we wasted energy on an argument that solved itself the moment I was willing to actually listen to what Freddie was telling me. And now, every time I work on music, I hear Freddie's voice in my head saying, "Does this serve the song, Brian?" And I try to answer honestly rather than defensively. I try to remember that collaboration means sometimes letting go of ideas you love because someone you trust sees something you're missing. The story of the November 1989 argument isn't dramatic. There's no tearful reconciliation, no profound moment of clarity, no dramatic gesture. It's just a normal creative disagreement between two strong personalities who couldn't find common ground immediately and ran out of time before they could fully process what had happened. But that ordinariness is exactly what makes it resonate. Most regrets aren't about grand, dramatic failures. They're about small moments of stubbornness, of ego, of prioritizing being right over being kind. They're about wishing you'd been more flexible, more generous, more willing to compromise on things that didn't ultimately matter. Brian May is now in his mid-70s, still performing Queen's music, still carrying Freddie's legacy forward. And when he plays that track from The Miracle with its simplified guitar arrangement, he no longer hears just his surrender in an argument. He hears a lesson he spent 3 decades learning, that time with people you love is more precious than being right, that creative partnerships require humility as much as talent, and that sometimes the best thing you can do for a collaboration is let go of your ego before circumstance forces you to. The argument itself wasn't important. The guitar arrangement, whether complex or simple, worked either way. What matters is what Brian learned from carrying the regret of that unnecessary conflict for 30 years. That we don't get unlimited chances to choose kindness over correctness, flexibility over stubbornness, presence over pride. And that every time we choose our ego over our relationships, even in small, ordinary ways, we're spending time we can't get back on conflicts we'll regret once that time runs out.